Just going to leave the poll up there for a little bit longer because I think some of you are having some trouble submitting. Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's webinar, Alberta's special webinar. Really appreciate everyone taking the time out of their end of day, evening to join me. I'm very excited. My name is Lee Tessler. I'm one of the senior consultants here at the Cirrus Consulting Group. I want to just thank our sponsors, Henry Schein, who we've been working with for over a decade now, and they continue to support the dental community, whether you're a dentist, specialist, denturist. They're a really, really great resource, and we're thankful to have them on our team. So we're going to get started. So I wanted to start off tonight's webinar with just showing you three numbers. These significant numbers, 85, 54, and 80. Now, what do these numbers mean? Well, 85% of dentists or denturists have a lease that can prevent them from ever selling their practice. 54% of dentists across North America are overpaying in rent for their practice. And 80% of landlords structure the lease to give them at least 50% of the proceeds of sale when the practice is sold. Now we're going to look and touch a little bit deeper into some of these numbers and what this actually means, but I just wanted to throw that out there to start with. Now, I think it's important for you to know a little bit about Cirrus and who we are and how we've been representing the healthcare community for over 25 years. We are a healthcare and dental specialist tenant representation firm. We were actually founded by dentists, for dentists in Alberta back in 1994. So we've been in business for over 25 years now. And since that time, we have negotiated over 12,000 dental and medical office leases, specific leases. And what makes us unique is we have an in-house legal team consisted of real estate attorneys, all with a background in healthcare. And annually, we represent over 500 doctors throughout North America. Now, as you know, tonight's course is a continuing education accredited webinar. Normally, when we're not in the current climate that we're in, I would be meeting a lot of you, seeing a lot of you face to face. Seeing that I haven't been able to travel for the last year, we've obviously all got used to the Zoom environment. But it is a CE accredited course. You will receive your credits probably within about 7 to 10 days after tonight's webinar via email. And we lecture at most of the major dental conventions, such as the Greater New York, the PDC, the Yankee Dental Conference, and the California Dental Association. And we really work with dentists and denturists and healthcare professionals nationwide. Now, I just wanted to pull up this slide just to look at some of our recent customers that we've, clients that we've really looked after. As you can see, you may actually recognize some of the names are on this slide. And you can see how many people and how many clients and that we've represented right across Alberta, from Fort McMurray, Prince Albert, to Spruce Grove, St. Albert, right across Alberta. We really have represented the market there. Now, as you can see, I asked my team just to pull up some current slides, some market trends and key indicators that we pulled some reports. And in terms of what we're seeing across Alberta, as the retail sector continues to suffer from the global pandemic and lots of office space becoming empty as businesses and their staff are working from home, what we're seeing is that the medical tenant is becoming more of the anchor tenant now. As a service business, which is essential, can't be done online, and people still need to visit their healthcare practitioner. So landlords are offering lots and lots of incentives, tenant improvement allowances, really to try and entice prospective clients to potentially relocate or open up a second practice. It's really a very tenant-friendly market, even though vacancies are continuing to rise. You probably be aware that there's lots of for lease signs as you are driving around to your office. But what we're seeing is that many of the healthcare professionals who may have been in office space are now having an opportunity to relocate to a retail strip plaza instead of a medical building. I also managed to pull up some slides just on some of the going rental rates in Calgary and in Edmonton. If you do want to know specific rent comparables in your specific area, then please make sure that you indicate later on your interest, and I can pull some specific reports, because you have to bear in mind that some of the rental rates really can depend on exactly the demographic, the area, the type of building that you're in. But the general trend is, as the vacancies come down and the rental rates have continued to come down, the forecast is that the rental rates, when the recovery, when we get through this pandemic, that the rental rates will start to increase again in the next few years. So the purpose of today's webinar. So we're going to talk about the importance of the office lease agreement. We're going to look at some of the key terms and conditions within your office lease agreement. And we're also going to take a little deeper dive and go through some practical advice on negotiating and some strategies. I mean, my goal is to educate you on a really complex topic. Make sure that you walk away tonight realizing, what a beneficial tenant that you are, and that everything is negotiable. Now, a lot of clients I speak to who've been leasing for a while always ask the question that comes about whether to buy the space, buy a building instead of leasing. So again, I want to just give you some of the pros and cons about buying and leasing. Now, when it comes to buying, obviously this requires a large upfront financial investment. And you become a landlord. You are now responsible. You will have to facilitate if there's any repairs, anything wrong with the plumbing or electrical equipment or anything. It becomes your responsibility. Now, if you're still practicing as well, you have to be on call. You are a landlord, and that sometimes can become a second job. You will earn rental income, and you do have greater flexibility on how you use your space. You don't have to ask a landlord. You don't have to ask permission if you want to make any changes. you have good freedom and control of your property. Now, what are some of the pros and cons of leasing? So leasing requires a smaller upfront payment. You have greater working capital to improve your equipment. And you have the flexibility to relocate or expand. You're not tied to that one location. And in some cases, depending on the demographic or where you are, if you own a building and that area for whatever reason in the future becomes less appealing, you are then stuck with that property. But I think the main point I want to get across is no matter whether you own a building, whether you lease a building, whether you're looking to buy a building, the dental office lease is still a very important part of your practice. Because if you are a landlord and you own the practice, it's still very important to have the office lease to separate the two holding companies. Because anytime in the future, if you do want to sell the practice and you want to keep the real estate, anyone else that comes in to buy that practice, they're going to need a lease, and you're going to have to detail exactly who's responsible for what and who has to pay for whether it's maintenance, upkeep of the property. Lots of clients that I work with who own their own building. It amazes me in certain cases where they don't actually have a lease in place, and then when they actually come to sell the practice, then they're scrambling to draw up a lease. So it's extremely important to still have a dental or a specific healthcare lease in place, whether you own or lease a building. Now, what is a lease? This is one of my favorite questions that I like to ask at all my webinars. Normally I would get a lot more feedback, but when it comes to a lease, what is a lease? Now, lots of people will say, it's a contract between two parties. It details the agreements on how long you're renting a space for and how much you have to pay. Now, from our experience, it's actually a check. And it's one of the most expensive checks you will write in your business career. Now, you take away your purchases of your residential property, but in terms of business, even if you just take on average that you're paying $5,000 per month for rent, and the average denturist, the average tenant will stay in their space statistically for 23 years. So even if we just take basic math, if you're renting and if you're spending $5,000 per month at $60,000 per annum, over 10 years at $600,000, over 20 years, we're talking $1.2 million. Now that doesn't include any rent escalation, any operating additional common area maintenance expenses, just the base rent. So you are writing a check for $1.2 million. Now, majority of clients will look at the first or second page of their lease, and then they will put it in their drawer, and they won't look at it again for another 10 years when it comes up for renewal. I really want to stress how important it is for you to understand how much you are contributing to the space, to the landlord over that period of time. And especially now in the current climate, why you are such a valuable tenant. And there's plenty of opportunities, as we'll see as we go through tonight's webinar. So why is the office lease so important? Your office location is the foundation of your practice. If you were to drive up there tomorrow on your way and get your Tim Horton coffee and pull up outside your practice, and you had a notice from the landlord giving you 30 days to an eviction notice, or there was a relocation clause in your lease or demolition, what would you do if you got that notice? How would that impact your business? You're not lawyers, you're not accountants, you can't just get up and move over the weekend. So it's extremely important to understand that the lease is the foundation of your practice. Now, as many of you may have known or have invested into or built out a practice, depending on whether you're a denturist or a specialist, depending on the type of operatories that you need to create, it's still an expensive business to enter into. It can be anywhere from $150 to $200 per square foot to build out a practice, a dental practice. On a 2,000 square foot space, you're looking at $400,000 just to build out, not even including equipment. And again, it's expensive and time consuming to move. Hence why majority of dentists, denturists will stay at the same space for a long period of time. And as we said at the beginning, it can affect the practice sell, whether you are selling the leasehold, the goodwill, the charts, however you sell your practice in the future, the lease can have an 100% effect on whether you can assign or transfer the lease. And also it gives you leverage. It's your asset. You want to have as much control over the asset as you can. So what are the key 3 sellable components of your practice? Does anyone know how, a dental practice, a denturist, how these practices are appraised? Now, obviously, it's different depending if you're a denturist or a specialist dentist. But the first thing we look at is equipment. We look at the depreciated value of the equipment in the office versus the initial investment costs and what it is at the present value today. Now, lots of practices can get hindered. The value can get hindered by the equipment, especially if it's very outdated equipment. So there is no harm in continuing to keep the practice up to date with new technology, new equipment. It just adds value to your practice in the future. Now, what else do we look at when it comes to valuing a practice? Goodwill. Now, goodwill is a term that is loosely thrown around in the industry. I mean, what does it actually mean? What does goodwill mean to you? The reality is it simply boils down to revenue. How much is each patient worth on an annualized basis? You may have been at the same location for 20 years and have a wonderful community and everybody loves you, but it really comes down to, how much patient comes into the office and how much that they spend per year and services rendered. And majority of the appraisal will come into the last 3 years of your last three financial years. And lots of people, when it comes to retiring or starting to slow down, then they may take the odd couple of days off, trying to improve on their golf swing, and that can significantly decrease some of the revenue when it comes to the last few years of your financial statements. But the main thing, again, which can have 100% impact, is the lease. The lease can have 100% impact on the valuation of the practice. If you cannot transfer the lease, you cannot sell the practice. It's simple as that. So what should your office lease do for you? Now, it should provide fair and affordable financial terms. So what do I mean by that? So we want to make sure that the rental rates are in line with current market rates. We want to make sure that in terms of your common area maintenance, your additional operating expenses, that you're not overpaying. In many cases, many scenarios, people who have a new start practice and the landlord throws a lot of incentives their way in tenant improvement allowance or free rent. Many times we see that can have a negative effect on the rental rates you end up paying. So it's really important to understand if you're being thrown certain incentives of free rent, tenant improvement allowance, to actually make sure that over the long term that you are still, being offered fair and affordable financial terms. Because as we know, there's no such thing as free money. We want to make sure that we have long-term stability and security. Now, what does that mean? We normally recommend a 10-year lease with 2-5 transferable options. And many doctors and many clients that I speak to, when their lease is coming up for expiry in the next year or two, and they're looking to transition, they believe that they'll just let the lease run its course, and then they won't renew for a longer period of time, and they'll just look to sell the practice when their lease expires. Now, this is a mistake that we see on a recurring basis, because it's important to understand that any potential buyer will still need term on the lease to get a loan from a bank, to amortize the loan over a period of time. So it's important as well that you have enough term. As long as the lease is structured specifically and the assignment language, the transferable language, which we're going to look at a bit later, again, is written clearly and in your favor to enable you to have that seamless sell, then it doesn't matter if you have a few years or 5 years left of the lease. Because what you don't want to do is run out of term. So we also want to minimize risk and exposure. So what do I mean by minimize risk and exposure? Now, many of you who would have started a practice or signed the lease maybe many years ago would have provided the landlord with a personal guarantee, even if you're incorporated. Now, this is quite common. The landlord may not know you. You may have been a new associate coming out of dental school, and you've provided a personal guarantee, which is fine. At that stage of your career, you've probably got a lot of debt and you don't have too much capital anyway. What we don't want to have is that personal guarantee on the lease for the duration of your lease of your working career. I'm amazed how many times I review a lease whereby a dentist, a denturist who's been at the same space for 20 years and has now built up a very profitable business is still providing the landlord a personal guarantee. And now, if something was to go wrong, the landlord can come after his personal assets, his home. So that's something that we certainly want to minimize, that exposure. We also want to maximize your flexibility. So what do I mean by that? Now, if you're in a space and you're bursting at the seams, you're at capacity, and the adjacent space next door comes available to lease, you want to make sure that you have the first right of refusal, so that if that became available, you would get the option to expand. You would hate if someone, if the lease space next door became available and somebody else took it over, and you were thinking that would have been perfect for you. So that just maximizes your flexibility. And in some cases, putting in the lease, right of first refusal, you can also put in the right of first purchase. So if you are looking at maybe potentially in the future buying the building, but not when you first built out the practice, didn't want to buy the building, but now situations changed, you may want to have the option to buy the building. So if the landlord is looking to sell the building, you would get the first right of refusal. Normally you would have 30 days to match a potential buyer's offer to buy the building. So this just maximizes your flexibility and control of the asset. And then we want to enhance your ability to eventually sell your practice. This really comes down to your asset versus liability. All the things we've talked about in the lease to make the lease a lot stronger and more valuable for the next person that was to come in. If you've got a well-structured lease with transferable options, good assignment, good language, then that's going to add value to the next person that comes in to buy your practice. Because we have a lot of buyers that will ask us to review leases that they're looking to take over. So if we see 3 or 4 different liabilities that could cost $20,000, $30,000, we're going to advise them. And normally what that does is just bring down the asking price of the eventual sale. So what's in your lease? Now, there are a number of different provisions, and for the interest of time, we're going to touch on a couple of provisions and just go through and discuss some practical advice. So this is the option to renew provision, which is found in 90% of leases. Now, many of you will know that when you have a lease, you may have a 5 or 10 year lease with 1 or 2 5-year options. Now, I'll give you a quick minute just to have a look at this slide. Have a little read of this slide just to see if there's anything that stands out, any red flags you may see. So just looking at this options to renew slide. Now, if we take the first line, the highlighted line, it says, provided that Dr. Joe Black shall remain as the tenant. As you can see, the tenant is, the T is capitalized. What this means is that the option to renew language, or the options that were provided to Dr. Joe Black, was personal to this doctor. Now, I was working with a doctor in Spruce Grove who told me that he had 12 years left on his lease, and he wasn't too worried. He was looking to sell the practice in the future, but he had 12 years left of term, and not a problem. Anyway, when I reviewed his lease, what it turned out was that he actually had 2 years remaining, and he had 2 5-year options. Now, those options were personal to that specific doctor. And when it comes to selling the practice, the landlord will say, well, I gave those options to you. I didn't give them to somebody else. I mean, this is just one of the plays the landlord will use, because they know that a new tenant coming in, taking over the practice, there's an opportunity for them to increase rents. So as you can see on this provision, there are a few other issues. If the tenant is duly and regularly paid its rent and performed all its covenants and obligations under the lease, has not been in default. Now, we were working with a doctor in Calgary who actually phoned us in tears. She had been in that space for over 20 years, and she was the most perfect tenant. Always paid her rent, everything on time. And when she came up to her last renewal, she had to give the landlord 9 months notice to renew her, to exercise her option and renew the lease, which she had always done. She gave notice well within that 9-month period. And the landlord refused to exercise this option. And she could not understand why, what had happened, what reason the landlord would not want to renew this tenant who'd been there for 20 years and to her was one of the perfect tenants. And what we established once we were retained and once we were involved is the landlord actually sent an email with a picture of this doctor front door, the front window of the business, which said doctor and the business hours. And it said Monday 9 till 5, Tuesday 9 to 5, Wednesday 9 to 5, Thursday 8 till 7, and Friday she was closed. Now, they had found her in default because in the lease, she had to have continuous operating hours in the plaza for 5 days a week. Now, a lot of you probably asking, why would they go to this trouble to find this one small provision, one clause, to find her in default, to get her out of the lease? Now, the answer to the question was one word, actually, Starbucks. She had a really nice corner unit of this retail plaza, and Starbucks wanted that unit and were willing to pay considerably more amount of rent. And the lawyers and the landlord found that this provision and that she'd been in default of the loan, of the lease. So, that's just an example that default can be a number of things within the lease, not just missing payments. Again, any such renewal shall be on the landlord's then current standard form lease. So if you've negotiated, if you've made changes to the lease and then you just exercise an option, the landlord can then move you back onto the current standard lease. So it's extremely important to understand that even in this provision, how many different red flags that we see, that we come across, that can cause a huge liability in the future. So I want to talk about one more provision. This is the assignment provision. It's one of the most important provisions that you will find in your office lease, whether you're a dentist, denturist, a specialist. There is obviously different value within your practice when it comes to sell, but the assignment provision is the most important provision in the lease. Again, take a quick 30 seconds, a minute, just to have a read through this provision. So, as you can see, the landlord has to receive prior written approval and consent in writing before the landlord will consent to any transfer. Now, this is quite common. The landlord is not just going to let you assign the lease to anybody. He wants to make sure that the person that's coming in to take over the practice is credible. But you can see here that the landlord can, once you request for consent, the landlord in this provision, the landlord has three options. One, just to approve the tenant's request. Two, it can simply just decline the tenant's request. And three, can terminate the lease agreement upon the effective date such proposed lease assignment or sublet is requested. So purely on the basis of just asking the landlord to assign the lease, the landlord can, within 30 days, terminate the lease. Now, this is what we call a termination provision. Again, found in 75% of dental leases. So the landlord here, it says, has the right to revise the minimum rent to be paid during the remainder of the term or greater than the current market of the premises of 15% or greater than current rent. So imagine you found a buyer, you've been negotiating the purchase sale agreement with the buyer, and at the sort of 25th hour, you ask the landlord for permission to assign the lease. He's a credible tenant. You think it should not be a problem. And the landlord says, sure, it's not a problem, but I'm going to increase the rent by 15%, which is written here, and they have every right to do so. Now, what do you think that's going to do to the value of your practice? Because if I'm the buyer that's agreed a price and I find out that just by taking over the lease, the rents are going to increase by 15%, I'm going to drop my asking price by 15%. Now, furthermore, should the tenant receive any rental income, cash goods, any form of consideration in connection with the assignment over and above the current base rental rates payable to the landlord in any fiscal year, the difference between the rental rate shall be paid to the landlord directly. This is what's known as proceeds of sale. The landlord knows you've been at this space for over 20 years. In his eyes, you've helped build the practice. His location has helped build your business. Now, if you've sweated blood, sweat, and tears for 20, 30 years, the last thing you want to do is be giving any of your consideration, any profits, no matter what you sell your practice for, whether it's $50,000, $500,000, or $1 million. You do not want to be giving the landlord any of that consideration. He should have no right to, the profit that you've built up and you've made from your goodwill, equipment, lease, like we've talked about. But we've seen this on numerous occasions where the landlord had written in the lease that he was entitled to 50% of proceeds sale. And a client who was selling his practice for $1.2 million, in the end, negotiated and had to cut a check for $120,000 because he was so desperate to sell his practice. And the landlord had him over a barrel. Now, once you've got through that, notwithstanding any consent or assignment, the tenant shall not be released from its obligations under the lease, shall remain liable for any failure of the tenant or its assignees to observe each and every covenant of the lease. So you finally get the landlord to agree consent to transfer the lease. But by doing so, the landlord makes you continually liable for the new buyer. So if a new associate, young doctor, maybe takes on too much expenses, buys a big house, buys a car, if he was to go, bankrupt 2-3 years further down the line, and you're retired, the last thing you want to do is get a call from the landlord. You're on the hook for the remainder of the term. So I think you can see here, just from this one provision, again, found in 75% of dental leases, 5 or 6 provisions that can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars of liabilities in the lease. Now, there are some other critical business impacting clauses. Again, for the interest of time, I'm not going to go through every provision. I know that the demolition and the relocation clause have had some impact and reason for questions, which we will take some questions towards at the end. I was working with a doctor just recently who's had a demolition and relocation provision in Calgary, and has just been served his 60-day notice of a relocation that the property developers, the landlord, have taken up, and now he has the uncertainty of having to be relocated to another part of the plaza. What does that look like? Now, it's not to say if you have a demolition provision in a clause that you can't sell the practice. There's many, some of the larger cities that have demolition clauses. But what we do is we look at those. We try to make sure that we have as much notice period as possible, whether it's a blackout period or just delay the notice period so that you have enough time to react to the certain provisions. The death and disability provision is something that Cirrus have really made their name on, something that we like to insert into every lease that we negotiate. God forbid something was to happen, whether you were incapacitated, become able to practice, worst case scenario, to pass away. This death and disability provision will enable your estate to terminate the lease agreement regardless of the number of years remaining on the lease. Almost like a free insurance policy. Again, there's a number of provisions, and I think my main, if I can get across tonight, that of course the financials are extremely important. What you pay every month for rent, what comes out of your business expenses is important. But as you know, in your careers, a lot of these preventative measures that we put in place so that there isn't that outcome, that unexpected relocation or unexpected provision in the lease that can cause serious impact to your business. And this is one slide that I actually managed to pull from one of our colleagues who used to work on the landlord, work for one of the landlords. It's the tenant lease cycle. Now, as you can see, we recommend starting to engage, or at least looking at the process 2 years before expiry date. And the reason that we do this is for a number of reasons, most what we've talked about tonight. The earlier that we can start to engage the landlord, find out exactly what is going on in the space, the best amount of leverage that we have. Now, as we know, it can take, anywhere from 6 months, a year to potentially relocate, to build out another practice, to find another space. So we want to start that process 2 years before expiry. Now, the landlord, they will delay and delay as much as possible. They'll say, oh, we've got loads of time, no problem. If they reply to your emails, if they actually get back to you, And then what they're trying to do is to push it as far around this little cycle towards that 12 to 8 months. Really, they want to get it into the red, because they know that if your lease is expiring in less than 6 months, you may have actually missed your option deadline. You may have actually missed I know someone's asked a question. We'll get to some questions shortly, I promise. You may well have missed the actual option deadline date. So one thing I would strongly recommend is that it's critical for you to know exactly when the lease expires. If you do have any options, how much notice do you have to give the landlord? Even if you don't want to exercise the option, it's vital to know the date and the timing. And the earlier we can start the process, the better leverage we have. Now, they don't need to know. You may be desperate to stay at the space. You may not want to leave. But if you start the process within that 2-year period, then you have that option. You have the option to explore. So what we're seeing in this current climate is an unprecedented opportunity. Whether you have a lease and you're just looking to renew the lease, there's an opportunity to reset financials. If you know that you're going to be in the space and you're happy with the space and the area, and you're going to practice for another 10, 15 years, then having a long-term lease renewal, having that, submitting to a landlord that you want to stay there and you're a wonderful tenant that's been there a long time, and how will they feel in this current environment when they, we submit a proposal to say we want to stay for a longer period of time, and it's going to be music to their ears. New starts, financing is at the lowest of our lifetime, equipment, supplies. I know Henry Schein will certainly look after you when it comes to equipment or supplies. And, landlords are desperate to fill vacancies. So I just want to talk about some of the strategies and tactics that we use, and we've been successful for over 25 years now, and how we've gone about doing that. So the first thing that we do is gather all the documentation. So we make sure we have all the existing lease, any amendment documents, any riders, all the documentation. And then we spend a detailed time understanding your career goals, your practice goals, where you are now, where you want to be in the future, to try and align the lease to your career. We would look at the lease, we look over for any liabilities, any areas of concern. Whilst we then prepare market research, we pay for a lot of data, a lot of rent comparables, vacancy reports, and then we would develop a strategy. And all these 5 things we've done all these 5 things, and we haven't even reached out to the landlord. So, one thing I would say is, if any of you have some issues and some things on your lease that maybe concern you, or, don't panic. The last thing I want you to do is ring your landlord tonight and say, I've got this, that, and I want to get rid of this, or I want to renegotiate that. That's a mistake, because this is what they do every single day, and this is what we do every day. We have designated lease negotiators. This is all that they do every day, and they know how to have the conversation. And we know lots of the big institutional landlords in Alberta, mum and pups. It doesn't matter on what the landlord, we have a strategy and know how to talk to different landlords. But like I said, before we've even just reached out to the landlord, we would then spend 15 to 20 hours negotiating some of the financial economics, whether that's the base rent, the operating additional expenses, any tenant improvement allowance, any landlord work. And then we spend 15 to 20 hours on negotiating some of the legal provisions like we talked about earlier. We would then do a final review just to make sure everything that was agreed is an executed copy, make sure that the landlord, before you sign that final document, is everything that we've agreed. And that's really, how we've been successful. And I just wanted to draw your attention to some of our latest Google reviews. We're very proud. We've had over 100 5-star Google reviews. Majority of clients saying it's the best money that they've ever spent on their practice. As you can see, very unsuccessful trying to negotiate with their own landlord until we got involved. I'm sure there's lots more that you can see. So we have what's called a critical dates and risk analysis. I'm going to come to some questions very shortly. Now, this is a normal value of $1,995, whereby we would spend 3 to 4 hours analyzing your lease, going through all 30, 50 pages, looking for any traps. We would then schedule a call to find out a little bit more about you and your practice and your plans for now and for the future. Discover and discuss some of the findings that we've uncovered and what your lease should look like, and really how to negotiate effectively a tactical plan. Now, thanks to our sponsors at Henry Schein, they are offering all of you, everyone in attendance tonight, a complimentary lease consultation. Now, even if you don't have a lease, even if you're a landlord, even if you're a young associate or you're looking to set up another practice, satellite office, or relocating, or whatever the situation is, you're all entitled to a complimentary consultation. Now, I have to make you aware that this is on a first come, first served basis. And there's a lot of people that have registered and attending the webinar tonight. So again, there will be another poll that will appear on the screen soon. There it is. So if you can just fill out the exit poll, just to, again, give us a little bit more understanding of your situation, when the lease expires, if you are presently a tenant, if the situation is urgent. And if you are interested in that complimentary lease review, like I said, it's on a first come, first served basis. I will reach out to every single one of you, and you have my word that because of the effort and Henry Schein's sponsoring this, then we want to make sure that we look after all Henry Schein's accounts as part of their business solution. So whilst you're just going through the poll, there are a few questions that I wanted to ask. Now, Dr. Kutzal has said he has 2 more five-year renewal options. If he has 2 more, what will happen if he does nothing? Well, if you do nothing, firstly, I'm sure the landlord will ask what you're doing. But if you do nothing and you don't, you miss your deadline and you don't notify that you want to exercise that option, whether it was a 6-month notice period, if you miss that, if you do nothing, then the options will become null and void. So technically, if you just let that run down, you will become a month-to-month tenant, which is something that we strongly advise against, because one, that means that the landlord can give you 30 days notice, and technically can kick you out. So you never want to be on a month-to-month tenant. Dr. Sandhu, I know we've been talking, and you wanted to talk a bit more about the demolition clause. We will definitely set up a time so we can speak a little bit more about your situation. But I think in general, the general question is if there's a demolition provision in a lease, can you sell it? The answer is yes. Some people, depending again on the language, on the time frame, may be put off by a demolition clause. But again, it depends exactly specific what area you're in, where you're at, because I can tell you that in downtown, in Toronto, in Vancouver, in certain places in Alberta, there will be leases that have demolition clauses, and they may have been in there for 10, 20 years and nothing's happened to the building. Does anyone else have any questions? I know that we are just around 6 o'clock now. I really do appreciate everyone taking the time at the end of a long day. I hope you've got some valuable information. If I can stress again, if you're unsure, if you have a lease that's coming up for expiry, then please make me aware. You can email me. You've got my contact details. You can call me, and we can have a detailed, thorough conversation. Any other questions? So I see one more question here saying, why my landlord, I have a difficult landlord, why is he going to negotiate with you? Well, we have that question. I have that question on numerous occasions where the doctor said, my landlord's very difficult and, he's not going to do anything, he's not going to change anything. And I can't tell you how many times when we've got involved, again, you've seen some of the process that we go through. And when we actually educate the landlord, in some cases, we make the relationship better. We appreciate that you still got to work with this landlord for a long period of time. We're not trying to go in guns blazing. We're not asking for any fees from the landlord. And once we educate them and say, look, this tenant has been there a long time and he's a great tenant and he wants to stay for a lot longer, and there's a few things that we'd like to address. I can't tell you how many times that, and you can see from some of the Google reviews, how many times that when we've got involved, the situation has changed dramatically for the good. And a lot of times, if I can be candid, you are professionals, you are good at what you do, and we're professionals, and this is what we do every day. And we know how to have the conversation. We know how to negotiate, and we know what to say, and it's proved very successful. So again, I really appreciate everyone taking the time out. Any other questions? So I have a question here. Our building is up for sale. We're currently under a sublease that expires June 2021. We're holding off renewing because thank you for that question, Tisha. I think it's best if we take this one offline. We set up a call and then I can find out a little bit more about your situation. I don't want to recommend something without knowing a little bit more about your situation, building, etc. but good question. So we just run over slightly. So I want to again thank you very much for attending tonight's webinar. Any other questions? Okay, so again, thank you very much. I look forward to speaking to a lot more of you in person over the next few days and weeks. And I wish you a healthy and happy evening. Stay safe.